Welcome back, HT Nation. Yes, this is my normal voice when it comes to doing the Adventure Box podcast, but there's a reason why I'm doing it. So, yesterday I had an interesting experience. My wife came downstairs while I was recording and then quickly went right back upstairs, and I knew it was her. She was the one in the house. And so when I talked to her afterwards, she was like, "There was some weird person in your room just a few hours ago." And I was like, "Yeah, that was me." And she has this big old smile on her face, and she thinks she's being so clever. But yes, I do like doing voices. I do like this opportunity to do the voices. So I'd like to hear what you have to say about that, or what your thoughts are about the voices. Because if you want, I will stop them. If you think they're interesting, I will keep going with them. So, but please let me know, because if I don't hear from you, I can't tell if you like them or not. So we're going to keep going with them. So we've done a Chinese accent. We've done an Indian accent. Now, out of complete respect for those nationalities and those groups, I try my best. I'm not the best at making these voices, but I like doing it, so I'm going to keep going. I've done a lot of Southern accents. I've done Western accents. So let's see what happens today with this Adventure Box podcast and see where we go. I mean, we're going to be talking about Mexico. We're going to be talking about the Civil War. We're going to be talking about France and Napoleon. So it could be a very staunch kind of my outrageous accent. Or it could be a, man, I have to listen to it before and hear what I was going to say when it comes to Hispanic. Let's see. You know, I do not know where this voice is coming from, but it is more of an Italian accent. So it's not that one. Okay, that's not a good one for this one. So we will see what happens. It could be a, "Hey everyone, this is Zach Edwards with another Adventure Box podcast, and we are in the West, and we're talking about the Civil War. So I don't know why we're in the West, except that it was actually Mexico that actually helped save the Union during the Civil War. You didn't know about this? We're going to be talking about that today. So all these different voices, I usually let nature take its course when it comes to trying to dictate what the voice sounds like, and I will try to go from there. Hopefully, in some time I'm talking about the Civil War, I'm not going to be doing a Chinese accent. Though in the Trails West, I might have done a Chinese accent when we're talking about the railroads. Or actually, the Civil War, we're talking about the railroads. Not now, but we will be in the future. Yes. And we mentioned about it last time. But so there's a lot of different voices that I could do. Let's see where this goes. So first off, hey there, History Adventures. Welcome back to the Adventure Box podcast, the only time travel podcast where we bring snacks to the battlefields and shout, wait, Mexico helped the Union? That makes no sense. But it's true. And we'll get to that when we get to that. So I'm your host, Zach Edwards. And today we're unpacking two fascinating Civil War stories you probably didn't learn about in schools. And you may have heard of a semi-controversial holiday called Cinco de Mayo, and how it's a Mexican celebration. But actually, it is not a Mexican celebration. It is a United States celebration. And it's not a United States celebration, well, as it could have been. So, as I say, we always talk about two things. The first thing, we will be talking about how Mexico and Spain indirectly helped the Union win the war. Now, it says Mexico and I said Mexico and Spain, but it's actually Mexico and France. And it's a whole big story. Even the UK was part of this story. And yes, it is part of the Cinco de Mayo, what we celebrate Cinco de Mayo for. Again, we will get to that when we get to that. The second part is the vital role of African Americans from contraband camps, is what they called them, to one of the bravest fighting forces ever, which is called the 54th Massachusetts Regiment. So, if you're ready for freedom fighters, international twists, and a whole lot of heart, let's march into it. First, let's start with what I was talking about, Mexico. Now, how does Mexico have anything to do with Cinco de Mayo? Now, Cinco de Mayo is supposedly a Mexican celebration, but goes so much further back. Now, my notes tell me to start in May 5th, 1862, but I'm going to go actually a little further back. So, when Mexico and Spain broke off, when Mexico won its freedom from Spain and pushed Spain out, it's more like it, then at that point, Mexico started having to live as its own. Now, just like the United States, when we broke off of Britain, we got into major debt. We had to pay so much money back and go into debt to build a nation. So did Mexico. But Mexico was borrowing from 3 countries: France, Spain, and Britain. Spain, wait a second. Yeah, there were still some financiers that were in Spain. So, this is what happened. You have Mexico all by itself, trying to live a life, getting into major debt, and all of a sudden, because the Civil War happened, there was a lot of trade issues that could not go forward, and so all of a sudden, there was no trade. No trade with Mexico and the United States. Mexico suffers. So because they suffered, they didn't have the money to pay back the 3 nations they were paying their debts off to. So what happened? Those 3 countries boarded ships, sailed across the ocean, and came, I have a map, I want to show you my map, came to a place, not Puebla yet, came to a place called around Veracruz, right around here. They all sailed and parked their boats outside the coast. Now, when they did this, they actually had, they all unboarded the ships, and that's where our basic story starts. So, all right, now picture this. It's May 5th, 1862. The U.S. Civil War raging on up in the north, but down in Puebla, Mexico, which I had it highlighted, Puebla, Mexico, that place right there, which it was very much smaller at the time, something epic is about to go down, and it's going to help the Union more than anyone else expects. So, during this war, you have, let's see, you have Lincoln juggling succession, which means when the Confederate broke off from the Union, you have slavery, and keeping the stovepipes hats upright. You know the hats he had. Emperor Napoleon III of France had an idea. Hey, the U.S. is distracted. What if we just invade Mexico and create a French empire in the Americas? No, it wasn't so simple. As I said, Spain, France, and Britain all came in, parked their ships outside of Veracruz. But Napoleon, his plans were actually to take over. His plans were made aware of the other two. The other 2 countries found out, and they automatically boarded their ships again and took back off for Europe. They were like, we are not part of this. Well, we do not care about you peasants. We will take care of the Mexicans by ourselves. Yep, Napoleon wanted to put a puppet emperor, his name was Maximilian I, on the Mexican throne and create a French stronghold right next door to the Confederate States. That's right, he was going to actually support the Confederate States up there when we won the French. This was bad news for the Union. If France helped the Confederates through Mexico, it couldn't be game over. More troops, more supplies, an international disaster, and we would be the cause as the French. So, what happened? Well, this is the story of what is called the Battle of Puebla. And it happened May 5th, 1862. Now, picture this. The French army, better equipped, more experienced, marches in expected as an easy win. But the Mexican forces, led by General Ignacio Zaragoza. Now, he's a legend. But we did not know that at the time. He was no legend before us. We made him a legend. So, not today, but back then, he was a legend. And he was a legend inside of Mexico, not in France. So, no, we had no clue. So, we attacked, and they defeated us. Well, they didn't exactly defeat us as much as they held us back until too many people were dying, and we gave up on Puebla. We decided to bypass it and go into Mexico City. But, that Mexican win slowed down France's invasion. It kept Napoleon busy and delayed his plans to support the Confederates. Translation? More breathing time and room for Lincoln. So, no Cinco de Mayo. Cinco de Mayo is not a Mexican Independence Day. That's September 16th. It's a celebration of the stop of an empire and maybe even saving the Union in the process. Now, again, this is my outrageous accent. And Spain, meanwhile, backed off of any idea of helping the South as well. Because we couldn't take over Mexico, they saw that the support was not there. So, they backed off. They basically saw our embarrassment of losing to Puebla, the small town Puebla. How in the world did that happen? I do not know. So, gracias Mexico. Wait a second, why am I saying that? So, ultimately, gracias Mexico. Thank you so much. Ole, Puebla, and viva the Union. So, this was what was happening down south inside of Mexico during the Civil War. You had Cinco de Mayo, the day that it is celebrating is not Mexican independence. It is the Battle of Puebla. This is why it's so important. May 5th, Cinco de Mayo, was the day that the Mexicans actually saved the Union. Now, maybe not fully. Maybe they could have done it and still taken on France or even Spain as well. But we don't know. And until that point that we actually do know, I say Cinco de Mayo is a great American celebration because we're celebrating a friendship, a relationship with Mexico and being able to hold off in the Civil War. If you want slavery, then you don't want Cinco de Mayo. If you want abolition, Cinco de Mayo was a great thing because, for one thing, Mexico did not like slavery. When the Texians put slaves into Texas, Mexico fought back. Mexico was an abolitionist state. Why? Because Mexicans were slaves to the Spanish beforehand. So, Cinco de Mayo, you're welcome to my house anytime, any year. And now, the next time you're enjoying guacamole or a mariachi band on Cinco de Mayo, raise your glass to the battle that might have just saved the North American country of the United States from losing the Civil War. And 0 cannonballs were fired on the U.S. soil. This had nothing to do with the Americans, but it inadvertently saved them from disaster. Now, let's talk about another story. Okay, so that's story number 1. I bet you never heard that in your classes. Story number 2, African Americans in the Civil War. Now, yes, it is actually taught in classes, but we're going to tell you a little bit more. We don't like this bird's eye view of looking down into history and saying, oh, we know all about it because we looked from the bird's eye view. No, we actually want you to see it from actually being in it. We want to see the stories as they're happening. Now, so let's shift our focus to the heart of the war. Let's go back into the Civil War because while political leaders argued and generals marched, African Americans were turning the war into the battle for freedom. They were the ones that had the most tied up in it. Yes, the United States might have split off, But the Confederacy probably would have, if it stayed the Confederacy, it probably would have stayed slavery. It would have had slavery a lot longer than it would have. Now, by today, it would have been gone anyways. Because slavery, that type of slavery, is basically gone throughout the whole world. Not exactly the whole world, but basically. There are places where there is still slavery in that sense. But it's very rare and different. So, when the Civil War began, Black Americans weren't allowed to enlist in the Union Army or the Confederate Army. The logic, this is a white man's war, but Black Americans were like, this war is literally about us, and we've got more motivation than anyone else. So that's why it was so important. Whites might have thought, oh, this is a white war, but it really wasn't. The blacks were saying, we have more in stake for this war. So that's why we want to serve, but they weren't allowed to at first. Now, later on, during the Emancipation Proclamation, they will be able to, but we're not there yet. Okay, so let's talk about the contraband camps. This is like the early resistance. When enslaved people escaped plantations, many made it to the Union lines. And what did they do? What did the Union do? At first, they didn't know what to do. They couldn't let them into the war, but eventually they labeled them, the escapees, as contraband of war, which means contraband camps. Translation, I'll give you a little translation, we're not returning you to your owners, like the Enslavement Act said, but you're also not technically free yet. Also, could you help us build a fort? Maybe carry supplies? So you couldn't enlist them, but the African Americans were happy to help to fight for their freedoms. So these became what we call contraband camps. They were safe-ish harbors for thousands of African Americans who had escaped, especially after a battle came through. When the Union was coming down into the South, they were taking over swaths of land. Now, anytime there was a plantation where they pushed out the Confederates, all those slaves would join up with the army, creating this contraband camp. Now, Lincoln changes the whole game. After he's able to win the wars we talked about last week, there's two major wars that he won last week. If you haven't heard it, go back to Thursday. Thursday will tell you everything you need to know. But because he won those two, he got the victories he needed for his momentum forward. And that's when he signed over and gave his Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. Now, the Union finally opened enlistment at this time. Now, we'll go over it just a little bit more later on, but we're just going over the African Americans and what happened to them. But this opening the enrollment, it basically let them, it opened up a floodgate. Black Americans signed up with fire in their hearts. Over 180,000 African Americans, 180,000 African American men served the Union Army. Now, served in the Union Army. At this point, they were no longer contraband camps, though if an army went through and took over and pushed the Confederates out, they'd still be contraband camps until they could actually make it up north to be freed and then come back as freedmen. Now, there was also another 20,000 African Americans that were put into the Navy as well. Now let's talk about one of the greatest, most heartfelt, most dedicated Army regiment in all of the Civil War. Let's talk about the most famous one of these units. It is the 54th Missouri Infantry Regiment. Now, this was formed in 1863, right after the Emancipation Proclamation, and this is where it was led by Colonel Robert Gould Shaw, who was white. Robert Shaw was actually an African American who was put in charge. He was the first official black regiment. I'm trying to remember. Give me 1 second. I'm going to grab a picture of him. Sorry, I should have been prepared for that one. This is Robert Gould Shaw. Now, he was in charge of the first official black regiment in the Union Army. He was happy to serve because he honored the people, the men that he served with. The soldiers were free black men from the North and former slaves from the South. And they were freedom fighters who knew this wasn't just a war, it was destiny. They had to fight, and they had to fight hard. And so, let's see, one of the battles. Let's talk about one of the battles. So the 54th went to Fort Wagner, Fort Wagner, July 18th, 1863. Again, right after the Emancipation Proclamation. They'd already signed up. They became a regiment. They trained and went straight into war. They were sent to assault Fort Wagner in South Carolina. So let's bring up this map again. I'm going to show you this. Fort Wagner. Fort Wagner in South Carolina. It's right there. Now, it's not there anymore. But to show you, it was on the tip. Remember that, Billy? Wait a second. We were just talking about that last week. Fort Sumter. Remember, that was the fort that was attacked. Well, they were sent to attack Fort Wagner. Now, it was a Confederate stronghold at the time. And it was basically a suicide mission. But they went anyway. They knew what they were getting into. Even their commanding officer knew what he was leading them into. But he was right there next to his men. It was this one, the actual soldier that was leading, was Sergeant William Kearney. The 54th charged through the gunfire, crossed a moat, and scaled the walls. They didn't win the fort, but their bravery shocked the nation. So they did not win this war. Again, it was a suicide mission, but there were a few that died. There was a good amount that died, but actually there was a lot that died. There was a good amount that died. Let me actually get the numbers. I brought that up, so I gotta find it out. Okay, so they say that 272 African American soldiers were killed in that assault. So, as I said, it wasn't a huge amount, but it was a good size amount. But they still went because, one, they honored what they were doing and they honored their leader, and two, they knew that it was needed. So they did what their commanding officer said and what his commanding officer asked them to do. In the end, by the end of the war, 1 in every 10 Union soldiers were black. They fought in over 41 major battles, and over 37,000 of the African Americans died in battle, many in segregated units. Because with this statistic, we're actually talking about the North and the South. So there were actually ones in the South that said they could get their freedom if they fought, or their masters said that they had to fight. So, yeah, they were often given the most dangerous jobs. So, like the suicide squad, no one wants to do this, so send them in. But their service proved that freedom must be earned and defended, and they did both. And they did it with their blood and their courage. So, what is their legacy? Today, we cover, we talk about them with great reverence and all that they did. The 54th Regiment is probably the bravest and the most dedicated soldiers in all of the Civil War. And I can actually say that. All the rest are very dedicated, but they knew what was on the line. And they put everything on the line for that. Their whole livelihood was on the line. Because again, there was free ones, and also, there were northern free African Americans, and there was former slave African Americans. If the Confederate won, all those former slaves would probably have to come back down and be enslaved by their former masters again as well. So what is the legacy of what we've been talking about today? So today we talked about how the Mexico's victory at Puebla. Now, I don't think I mentioned this, but in the end, they actually lost Mexico City. Maximilian I was actually put in place, but it didn't last long, especially when the United States won. France basically said, we're out of here. Because they knew they couldn't hold up, because the United States wanted to return the favor and was actually going to attack and kick out France from Mexico as well. So, they might have, who knows what would have happened if Puebla did not win their battle. But all we can say is Cinco de Mayo is us, the United States, celebrating that victory because it could have affected the war. Now, the second legacy is how the African Americans transformed the war into a fight for human dignity and liberation. So, from the mariachi trumpets to the battle drums of the 54th, this war wasn't just fought in the fields of Virginia. It was fought in the hearts of everyone who believed in freedom. So thank you for turning to the Adventure Box podcast. I'm Zach Edwards, your guacamole loving, cannonball dodging, truth chasing host, reminding you that history is diverse, surprising, and full of unsung heroes. I mean, a lot of unsung heroes that we don't usually talk about. But stay tuned for next time. We'll be talking about Gettysburg and watching Lincoln write his most famous 272 words. That is the Emancipation Proclamation. So, until then, thank you so much for joining us, and we will talk to you next time. Take care, y'all. Bye. If you have any comments or questions, add them to the comments below. Otherwise, we'll see you tomorrow, actually. Take care. Bye.